tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Hana Burgess. I'm Māori. I hail from the tribes of Ngāpuhi, Te Roroa, Te Ātihaunui-a-Pāpārangi and Ngāti Tūwharetoa from across the North Island of Aotearoa, or so-called New Zealand. As I begin my talk, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples around the world resisting imperialism and settler colonialism. Across the Pacific Ocean to the Kanak people of what is known as New Caledonia, Indigenous peoples of Palestine, West Papua, Congo, Sudan, Indigenous peoples around the world. I'm here today recognizing that our struggle here in Aotearoa as Māori is bound up in theirs, and so too is our liberation. So as I get to share this presentation on this beautiful rainy day in the relative safety of my own home, they are never far from my thoughts. Nō reira, tēnā tātou. I'm a doctoral student at Te Kupenga Hauora Māori, the Department of Māori Health at the University of Auckland, where I also teach postgraduate theory and kaupapa Māori research, where we focus on critical and decolonial theory in the Indigenous health context. When I say kaupapa Māori, I am referring to a critical decolonial theoretical space that emerged from Indigenous Māori resistance to colonialism, particularly in the 1980s, with distinct foundations in our Indigenous worldviews. So kaupapa Māori provides us a space to be Māori in the academy, although it has ontological, epistemological, and axiological foundations that exist way beyond this space. Alongside my work at the university, I'm also a creative. I make collages, I make zines, many of which are collaborative works. I'm a member of queer and creative communities. I spend time with my friends and loved ones in cafes, on dance floors, and in our local community where I garden and grow food with our old people. All of these spaces are where I do my best thinking. And community is where I found the greatest theory and the greatest theorists. And my collages reflect this. The collages that accompany this talk today have all been made throughout my doctoral journey. A collage is a process of thinking through and beyond colonial texts to reshape, reorder, and damage text and images that reflect colonial imaginings of our worlds. My collages are reimagining and a re-remembering of our relational worlds as Indigenous peoples, and they accompany this talk today as an acknowledgement of the role that creative practice and visual art plays in my thinking through citational practice, which has really allowed me to deepen and widen my vision in relation with my communities that I'm a part of. So in my talk today, I'm going to be talking about citational practice, which I understand essentially as who, how, and why we cite. I will be doing this through storying my journey as an Indigenous PhD student with an intense discomfort around the norms, institutional norms and conventions around citational practice. I will talk about how I refused and how this refusal was theoretically generative, leading me on a big old journey of making sense of citational practice from an Indigenous kaupapa Māori's perspective, which centers relationality. I will then introduce some of the 10 ethics of Indigenous research, which are offered by the late Moana Jackson, which have shaped my envisioning of a kaupapa Māori Indigenous citational practice. Ultimately, this presentation is an invitation. It is an invitation for you to deeply and critically consider what citational practice means to you or could mean to you as a student, as a researcher, as a writer, and as a community member. So from your own positionality or from your own context, really consider who, how, and why do you cite, which also calls into question how you relate to the academy. I have no conflicts of interest to declare per se, but I do want to share that the work I present today was done in relation with my tuakana, my mentors, and my supervisors, Donna Cormack and Paparangi Reid, who are both amazing Māori women This work has been published in a paper we wrote together titled Calling Forth Our Past, Citing Our Futures, and Envisioning of a Kaupapa Māori Citational Practice. And this work's also based on a chapter I co-authored with my friend Te Kahuratai painting titled Ona Mata Ana Mata, a whakapapa perspective of Māori futurisms, which was published in the book Whose Futures. So doing Indigenous work in the academy. Engaging in PhD research in Indigenous work in the Westernized academy is to be situated within institutions whose values and organizing principles are built on and sustained by imperialism and settler colonialism. Black and brown peoples have long articulated the role that the academy plays in the colonial project. I am particularly influenced by the work of Māori scholar Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, a Māori theorist who is well known for her book Decolonizing Methodologies, iconic. And I'm also influenced by the late Moana Jackson, who was a Māori scholar who really focused on the areas of decolonization, constitutional transformation, and Indigenous rights. And they really speak to the way that a key function of the academy has long been to damage and disrupt Indigenous ways of knowing, replacing these with Western knowledge systems, which are premised on violence, domination, and control. This constitutes the very foundation of the academic institutions and the disciplines that we all work in. And much like the colonization of our lands and waters, the colonization of Indigenous knowledges, the knowledge systems of Black and brown peoples, is sustained and deliberate. Moana Jackson reminds us that, and I quote, "Among the many brutal, damaging things that colonization has done to Indigenous peoples, it has been to convince Indigenous peoples that there is indeed only one way of seeing the world, only one system of knowledge. And if there is some belated recognition of an intellectual tradition held and treasured by Indigenous peoples, it has a certain quaint, exotic interest and may provide some worthwhile perspective on the greater dominant colonizing knowledge paradigm, but it is somehow not universal. What is deemed universal has of course been European," end quote. So the academy remains a key site for the maintenance of this myth of a universal knowledge system, which is expressed in rules and conventions about what counts as knowledge and what is considered academic, valid, or true. And we can see this across the Westernized academy, that knowledge is largely constructed around hierarchies of race, class, and gender, where observable, measurable, human-centered knowledge that is written and published is seen as more valuable. And even within published knowledge, there are hierarchies. Knowledge is so deeply hierarchical at every layer. And this presents an interesting context for Indigenous peoples, because we have long recognized the potential of the academy and the value of engaging in PhD work in this space. Yet it's contradictory. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and Graham Smith talk about the contradictory nature of the academy, in that it has enormous potential to facilitate the positive transformation of Indigenous worlds and Indigenous lives, but equally it can also be a major influence of the continued colonization and oppression of Indigenous peoples. So in Aotearoa, the potential of the academy, I believe, has been harnessed most notably by kaupapa Māori, but it is a tumultuous space, and it's a space where we have to be very clear and intentional about our ethics. So the institutional conventions and expectations around citational practice play an important role amongst the academy, amongst the upholding and the strengthening of the power structures that constitute the academy, functioning to keep us, students, researchers, within the confines of what counts as knowledge in the academy, keeping us bound to cycles of reflecting and reproducing Western knowledge systems. Sara Ahmed, who's a critical voice on the politics of citation and a huge influence on my work, states, and I quote, "I would describe citation as a rather successful reproductive technology, a way of reproducing the world around certain bodies." And these bodies Sara Ahmed refers to are those of white men. She writes, "I might need to add cis, straight, and able-bodied to the general body I'm evoking." So as researchers and as students, we are taught to abide by the authority of certain types of knowledge and certain knowers. Institutional conventions and expectations around citational practice ensure this. And if we do not cite accordingly, our credibility is questioned. These norms serve as a constant reminder of who the Academy can imagine as a credible knower, and they let us know our place as Indigenous peoples. And I definitely internalized this as a student, and I still find myself getting caught up in these systems of power and these institutional conventions and expectations. I felt like that I had to be well read in Western European philosophy in order to do any kind of legitimate theorizing in the academy. And I was made to feel that the embodied experiential knowledge that I felt and that my deep engagement with Indigenous communities and theorists was not enough. As a queer Māori woman, I was never enough. And Moana Jackson really emphasizes that the struggles of Indigenous knowledge in the academy are epitomized in literature reviews, which is expected as a part of any doctoral thesis or major piece of academic work in the university. He says what they mean by literature review is stuff written by white people. And this was a huge light bulb moment for me. I was really beginning to see the ways that as doctoral students in particular, we are required to locate our work within or descend from these academic disciplines, from the ideas of, in the words of Sara Ahmed, cis, straight, able-bodied white men. So for Indigenous doctoral students, this means locating ourselves within the settler colonial ideologies that continue to damage and disrupt the knowledge systems of our people. And it was during the literature review for my doctoral thesis that I was really struck by this. I was expected by the discipline of public health to center Western notions of health that are deeply rooted in biomedical understandings of the body. I was expected to center knowledge and ways of knowing premised on violent systems of discovery, extraction, classification, and domination that were supposedly universal, divorced from the lands and the waters that keep us well. I was expected to center Western voices, Western knowledges, and kind of slot myself into canonical thought. And from here I could provide an Indigenous perspective, but it was merely a perspective on a center that was deeply Western and deeply colonial. And I thought to myself, this is not the story I want to tell. I just couldn't do it. And so I refused. I refused to write a doctoral thesis that reproduced the world around the bodies of cis, straight, and able-bodied white men. And at the time I was navigating this, I was also involved in frontline activism, protecting Indigenous land from commercial development in Aotearoa. The whenua, the land we were on, is Ihumātao. And on this whenua, on this land, I was in deep conversation with community, with friends, and learning so much from the lands that we were on. And I began to see parallels between what was happening to the land and what was happening to my PhD. As I was expected to fit myself into these intellectual genealogies of white men, I was seeing the dominance of white supremacy and the dominance of colonial ways of being, knowing, and doing. And so it was when I was on this land that questions began to arise about how I would cite my ideas in a way that honestly reflected the theoretical foundations of my PhD. How would I cite my friends? How would I cite community? How would I cite the land? And importantly, how would I cite my ancestors? And it was from these questions where it became more and more explicit that institutional conventions and expectations around citational practice would not allow me to be myself and do the work that I found necessary. I just refused to reduce myself to fit into the intellectual genealogies of white men. My supervisor, Donna Cormack, was totally on board and supportive, and in the same way, she didn't want to supervise another PhD that did this. And so we worked together, and she pointed me to the work of Indigenous scholars Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang, and the work of Audra Simpson, who had written amazingly about refusal as a deeply Indigenous practice. They write that refusal is more than just a no, and that it's theoretically generative. Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang write about refusal as a redirection to ideas otherwise unacknowledged or unquestioned. They talk about refusal as an opening, as an expansion, as space to use our imagination. And so through refusal, the possibilities of who, how, and why we cite open up. At the time, I was also reading the amazing work of Sara Ahmed, who I've mentioned, a feminist scholar who wrote the book Living a Feminist Life, which is a really important text for me. I was also reading the work of Black scholars Tao Lee Goff. I was engaging in the Cite Black Women campaign, which was founded by Kristen A. Smith, and I was reading the work of Catherine McKittrick. And it was in this refusal that I reoriented myself and my work to the work of Black and Brown peoples. And this propelled me to consider what citation would look like for me as Māori, and to immerse myself in the ways of knowing on my ancestors, which took me on a huge journey. And so where I landed is around relationality. Relationality is at the core of Māori ways of being, knowing, and doing, which structures a world premised on the notion of being in good relation, which is a common thread connecting Indigenous knowledge systems around the world. Relationality shapes our ethics and extends beyond our human relations to our more than human kin, our lands, our waters, and the creatures that inhabit throughout. With this, Māori knowledge is relational and reiterative. Knowledge emerges through intimate and dynamic relationships with the world around us, which transcend physical time and space. So here, knowledge has a greater sense of collectivity, and when we share knowledge through any medium, we do so as a part of a network of intergenerational relationships. We can come to understand texts, the communication of knowledge, thoughts, and ideas, as extensions of the relationships, communities, and environments from which knowledge emerges. As Indigenous peoples, our ways of knowing, our knowledge systems are in relation with past and future generations all the time. Our bodies are places of intergenerational dialogue, and this too is true for our bodies of work. As researchers, we are in relation with those who have shaped our knowledge, those who we do our work alongside, and those who will engage with our work in the future. And within this worldview, citations can be conceptualized as a way of acknowledging and nurturing these relationships. They are an expression of our relationality. Tao Lee Goff puts this really beautifully, where she says, "All writing is relational. Citations illuminate the web of thought in which we locate ourselves." So citational practice is acknowledging that our knowledge is not ours alone, but it is occurring as a part of a network of relationships that are continuously unfolding or infinitely cascading from each of us all of the time into and through our pasts and futures. Thinking about citational practice in this way has been a huge shift from what I had been taught in my research papers in undergrad. I'd been taught about research ethics in relation to very specific parts of the research process, mainly in relation to engaging with participants in data collection, analysis, and dissemination. Ethics was taught at a very rigid procedural level, and mainly around the institutional ethics application process, which was just something we kind of had to get through to carry out research. Yet stemming from refusal was an opportunity to expand my thinking about ethics as a whole, questioning what it would look like to have ethics shape how I engage with text, and how were the ethics of Indigenous research guiding me at each stage of the research process in everything I did, including when I was reading. And in this opening, I realized that there is so much to draw from. There are such rich knowledges that exist in Māori and Indigenous thought. And it also felt really obvious, like Black and brown peoples have been doing the work. So, in order to envision a kaupapa Māori citational practice, I drew from the 10 ethics of Indigenous research offered by Moana Jackson. He was a brilliant orator and presented these at 2 Indigenous conferences in 2013 and 2016. And I have cited these talks at the end of my presentation. I really recommend giving them a listen. Moana Jackson offers 10 ethics: the ethic of prior thought, the ethic of moral choice, imagination, change, time, power, courage, honesty, modesty, and celebration. And he offers these ethics, and I quote, not as a list of definitive ethics, but rather as something which I think as Māori and Indigenous peoples we might like to bear in mind whenever we begin to question ourselves or others or the lives we would like to live. So I'm going to share a couple of these ethics now. The ethic of prior thought. The ethic of prior thought is the idea that to make sense of the world around us, we must draw from the deep and insightful knowledge of the generations before us, which has been and continues to be developed, reviewed, refined, and expanded upon over generations. To cite prior thought is to locate ourselves within the rich intellectual genealogies of our communities, of Black and brown people who have been writing into and through settler colonial knowledge systems, and let these form the foundations of our research. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith talks about this in terms of reorienting our reference points for knowledge, and she states, and I quote, "It is time to shift our scholarly orientation to new reference points, new old genealogies of knowledge, Indigenous intellectuals and theorists, and new networks of decolonizing and Indigenous scholars. It is important to privilege and cite Indigenous scholarship and make positive contributions to Indigenous ideas. It is still desirable to read a wide literature by a range of Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors, but the Western Academy should no longer occupy the principal position or point of reference and authority on Indigenous subject matters. We should no longer need to plough through 200 or more years of racist scholarship about Indigenous peoples to help inform our questions and shape our knowledge. We can choose to know that literature from a different intellectual position and bring an Indigenous analysis to what this tells us." End quote. So this tells me that the ethic of prior thought is a really foundational ethic. It's about decentering whiteness. It's about decentering the academy and transcending hierarchies of knowledge. It is about reorienting ourselves to Indigenous decolonial thought. Sarah Ahmed explains, "My citation policy has given me more room to attend to those feminists who came before me. Citation is feminist memory. Citation is how we acknowledge our debt to those who came before, those who helped us find our way when the way was obscured because we deviated from the paths we were told to follow." End quote. So that's the ethic of prior thought. Next is the ethic of change. Moana Jackson suggests that research that does not seek to transform the status quo is not ethical. And in this, transformation is not only about the outcomes of research, but the everyday processes and practices that constitute research. Sarah Ahmed calls citation a powerful reproductive force, and thus with critical intent can be a powerful force for transformation. We can stop reproducing the world around the bodies of white men. We can transform the foundations of our work and everything that arises. It is in these transformational processes that we shape our futures. This is closely linked to the ethic of power. The ethic of power acknowledges that research is concerned with the generation of knowledge, and that research is never divorced from power. Moana Jackson emphasizes that research that does not acknowledge or engage with power structures is dangerous for Indigenous peoples, and this aligns with the critical decolonial element of kaupapa Māori research. As with the Westernized Academy, institutional conventions and expectations around research exist to maintain and further entrench these imbalances brought about by settler colonialism. And so our research as Black and Brown people must contribute to the restoration of balance. The ethic of power, I think, is very important in the context of ethics, because centering our work around critical decolonial intellectual genealogies allows for a powerful foundational critique that is grounded in our knowing as Indigenous peoples. And so often our Indigenous worldviews and knowledge are applied at a more surface or procedural level. You know, we can offer a perspective, but it's in a way that leaves the deeply unethical foundations of many research processes and practices intact. So citational practice calls us to consider the power dynamics at play, the role of colonialism, and consider what a decolonial approach to research looks like at every stage of our work. So this is more than a perspective, and it's more than a question of procedure. These ethics are really foundational. And next is the ethic of imagination. The ethic of imagination encourages us to use our imagination as we make sense of the world, as we ask questions and go about seeking answers. Imagination is how we can expand our relational worlds and see beyond realities imposed by settler colonialism. We can see beyond systems of power. Imagination has long been an important practice of Indigenous peoples, allowing us to imagine outside of current contexts and see that settler colonialism is not natural, normal, or inevitable. We can see that things can be radically different. And so to research imaginatively in the PhD process is to engage with creative processes and practices as well. And it means imagining beyond institutional ideas of what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes research practice. Next is the ethic of courage. Critical decolonial research takes courage. It takes courage to do research that seeks to transform the status quo, especially as we are constantly reminded of and disciplined by institutional norms and conventions around citational practice. I really appreciate courage as an ethic, and I also know that it's a key value of Black and Brown and bioethics. As Indigenous peoples, we must be courageous in choosing our topics, and we must be courageous in carrying these out ethically. Everything about the institution leads us to individualistic, hierarchical modes of work, and so to break away from that is courageous. And of course, we can draw on the courage of our ancestors and of our communities and really take their lead and know that we can do the same. Next is the ethic of modesty. The ethic of modesty is to remind ourselves that we are descendants of generations before us and that we will one day be ancestors. We can research accordingly. To research modestly is to acknowledge our smallness, but in a way that is empowering. It is acknowledging that we are not alone and that we are part of bigger movements and that we each have unique roles in these. Through citation, we can acknowledge the wider peoples and movements to which we relate. I reflect here on my role as a researcher to these broader Indigenous struggles. Researching modestly reminds us to recognize the collective efforts of our people and to resist individualistic, ego-driven citational practices. Citing modestly is acknowledging who we are as a part of infinitely expansive networks of relationships. And lastly is the ethic of celebration, which Moana Jackson ends on. The ethic of celebration calls on us to celebrate who we are as Indigenous peoples, or as Black and Brown peoples and communities, to celebrate where we have come from and where we are going. It means engaging in our intellectual traditions with pride. It means taking the time to have joy in what we do. Linda Tuhiwai-Smith says that fantastic intellectual work comes out of the joy of thinking about ideas and being engaged with people who find the same. Citation can feel good, and our work can feel joyful. And I wanted my work to feel good. And that's not to say that we shouldn't do work that is hard and critical work that engages with systems of oppression and violence, but that we can do it in a way that is grounded. And I wanted to do my work in a way that was grounded in who I am, in the communities that I am a part of. And I wanted to do work that was taking me beyond these systems of oppression. And citational practice has been a way to help me do that. So I wanted to end my talk again with an invitation for you to deeply and critically consider what citational practice means or could mean to you. From your own positionality and your own context, what could the foundations of your work look like? How might you reorient yourself? And, even thinking what makes you uncomfortable and what makes you refuse, and how could that be generative? Graham Smith and Linda Smith write, "There is a need for all of us to appreciate that what may seem a utopian vision is worth striving for and may be won through a series of small and incremental gains rather than singular and spectacular actions." So this is my small and incremental contribution, and each citation a small and incremental gain. Thank you. For this presentation, I could acknowledge so many people. In the interest of time, I want to acknowledge my supervisor, Donna Cormack, and Paparangi Reid for the generosity, guidance, passion, and collaboration on my work. I want to thank the Black and Brown and Bioethics team, especially Kameri, for your invitation into this space. This work reflects the vast and expansive networks of my relations. So alongside the works cited in the next slide, I also acknowledge the many theorists in my life, my family, friends, communities, and my more than human relations, the many layers of existence that constitute our worlds. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Work cited, which I will have available. Thank you.